Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad you could all be here. My name is Peter Armstrong. I am the business correspondent at CBC News. And there you go. That's me. The business that we're here to discuss is what is the business model of our business. And I think we've been debating this for my entire career. I came in slightly after TV journalists had a crack at going to the States and being a big Amnet, and print journalists were off to go get book deals, and for the bulk of my career, people have been asking, what on earth is this going to look like? And so we've convened this pretty amazing panel to try to get at the bottom of that from the end. Asmaa Malik is an associate professor at Ryerson School of Journalism. Keith Robinson is the director of digital products and business development at Global News and Corus, and Stephanie Wilson-Chapin is the senior director of digital products at Bell Media. We're going to sort of dive into it pretty quickly here. It's a pretty small and intimate room, so like literally put your hand up. I think we've all kind of got a couple points we want to make or that they want to make, and then I'm going to try to facilitate. And then let's talk and let's see if somebody has a bright idea, because I think it's due time for us to crack this nut. Denny, you want to go first? Asmaa, do you want to start from the end?
First.
There you go.
Okay. So thanks for having me here. I'll just give a quick introduction about what I do and why this question is important to me, what the future looks like. I am a professor at the School of Journalism at Ryerson. My research and my practice is sort of focused on entrepreneurship in journalism and journalism innovation. And it's increasingly more important for journalism students to have an understanding of that side of the business. I don't think that, while of course I think when it comes to reporting, the importance of a wall between, the commercial side and the journalism side is very important, but I don't think that that journalists should limit themselves to just the facts in terms of reporting. I think they need to understand they need to understand their audiences, they need to understand who they're writing for, how are people going to read them, how is their work going to actually be actionable for people? And the huge part of that is, how is their company going to keep making money? So for me, that's particularly important. So that's why, as part of journalism education, I do stress the importance for students to understand this side. Another thing, when I touched on my practice, I've worked on a few news incubators looking at news innovation. One of the biggest ones we did was last year. The Digital News Innovation Challenge, which was a partnership with Facebook and DMZ at Ryerson, in which we had 5 startups who are looking at different areas of news innovation, and they were given each $100,000 to develop their ideas over the last summer, over 5 months, in the incubator at the DMZ. The most interesting thing from that was that of the 5 companies that were in the incubator, only one of them was started by a journalist. 4 of them were actually started by technologists and marketing professionals in the digital space, and I can go into more detail about some of the technologies that we're looking at, but to me that the most important lesson from that is that this is not something that journalists are going to solve themselves. This involves smart partnerships and thinking innovatively and collaboratively with people across the digital space.
Great. Keith, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, well, I'll definitely pick up on that. I mean, we can certainly talk about some of the different models and what's working and what isn't, but to pick up on what Asmaa was saying, I think it really is interesting and important to be having this sort of conversation and focusing on entrepreneurial aspects as well as the journalism. I think that would have been maybe a controversial thing at one point, and perhaps it still is within some organizations, and church and state exists for practical reasons, but I do think it's a great area to be getting into, to have sort of everyone involved in understanding what the business model is and what the possibilities are, and having that sort of entrepreneurial culture, and trying to, even within large organizations, if we can learn from the kinds of things that you're doing, that could really help in terms of the future.
Okay. I think we talked a little bit about this on the call. I agree, and I actually think that journalists are some of the most entrepreneurial spirits there are. And I don't know about you, but when I started off in journalism, I didn't really think of myself as a business person. Anything to do with numbers or analytics or sales, I just was like, oh God, please someone else deal. When in fact, what we need to do, of course still respecting our ethics and integrity, is understand the model of monetization, and actually so that we can be comfortable with it and that we do ensure that integrity is maintained. And the minute, you know, you share basic numbers and analytics with the news team and help them understand where revenue is coming from, they automatically make all of the right decisions almost immediately, and they contribute amazing ideas. And I think the more that we can get comfortable about talking about the business side, the better off we're all going to be. Again, still respecting, you know, the integrity and independence of our journalism. We should still be able to talk about how to make money. And I think we can. I think we're perfectly equipped to do so.
If I can pick up on that last point, because you mentioned that on the call. I was lucky enough to talk to these guys before we came in, so I'm a little more armed than some of you. That this notion that when people know the business side of it and the monetization side of it, they're automatically making the right decisions. What do you say to the people who say that leads to clickbait, and that leads to people sort of going down rabbit holes of trying to get clicks and money rather than committing the kinds of journalism, which is why that sort of church and state was initially in place?
Well, here's the good news, and I think that's what we're here to talk about, is there's so many amazing and creative revenue models that are coming to the fore in our business. Everything from direct response advertising and podcasting to crowdsourcing, investigative journalism. I think there's so many different avenues you can go down rather than just writing a ridiculous headline that someone's going to click on that's going to get you 5 cents for about 2 minutes.
I just wanted to jump in to say I think that's really important. I think what people are actually going to pay for is something that becomes part of their routine. The Reuters Institute just did a survey on this in paywalls in Europe where they were looking at what are people going to pay for? And you know, somebody mentioned Netflix in the podcasting panel just earlier, and people do pay for content that's actually part of their routine, part of their habits, stuff that they actually need. And so I think when we're looking at what will make people pay and what memberships are worth value, I think it's something that becomes part of your habit, and things that become part of your habit are generally fairly substantive.
Yeah, and even with an ad support model, and we're primarily ad supported, there's a nice sort of alignment starting to happen in terms of, you know, a few years ago, really all you cared about was a page view. The ads loaded, and whether someone read for 2 seconds or 2 minutes, you made your money. You know, we've had a lot of success with moving towards viewability as a metric, and so what really matters is being able to show how long that, you know, actual humans saw the ad and that they saw it for a certain length of time. And able to load more ads the longer people are reading, the more they're engaging. And so that kind of can work well where your sort of business interests in terms of how much money you're making on ads and your interests in terms of engaging an audience, having a loyal audience, having them there for a long time and coming back, which is really fueled, I think, by good journalism and not by clickbait, because you can sort of see that the clickbait is very ephemeral traffic. And so it's sort of, in a way, possible to start to line up the business interests and the editorial more with some of these new models.
I'd be interested, Keith, in your take on where do you think we are in the evolution? Do you think we're still in the early stages of figuring this out? Is it more maturing now that we're seeing in the Apple News models and, you know, the proliferation of podcasts? Like there are a bunch of niche roles out there that now clearly work. The legacy media are trying to get on board with some of those. Where do you think we are in terms of getting towards a place where it's just sort of natural for us all to live in this new world?
I suspect, I don't know if we ever get there, you know, like I think it's one of these things where you just have to be, you know, as a company, we've done a lot of work in terms of change management. And so you do some training on change, and there's often this thought that it's sort of like, well, we're going to go through a change, and then we'll get to that place there, and then we'll sort of settle down and do our thing. And I think the reality is you're just going to live within this sort of culture. And I sort of feel like if I have a sense of where things are going to maybe be 8 months out, I'm feeling pretty good about that, you know. And I think that's maybe just the reality is that you're constantly, and I would say then that what you want to be is really attuned to what's going on and able to sort of try things and turn the ship pretty quickly.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say initially, well, I feel like we're in really early days, but I feel like I'm always saying that.
Right, it's been 20
Because
years.
honest to God, like, you know, you just get your head around one new platform. You know, you hear about voice. Oh God, okay, well, and then there's about 6 different voice applications you need to build, and then there's some new ad product or some new platform, and really it always feels like it's just so early, because it's constantly changing. I feel like there's about a reset. Maybe the cycle is every 8 months or 12 months. If I look at our roadmap a year ago, it looks so different now because, well, Apple News popped up. Voice started to surge, you know what I mean? So I think we constantly feel in the state of newbiness.
But do you think Apple News, and maybe Asmaa, you can weigh in on this, do you get the sense that Apple News is any different than any of the other, like I see The Athletic and The Logic and, you know, a bunch of different niche organizations that have popped up that have been eminently successful. The Economist has been doing that forever, right? You find a market, you go to them, they pay you, it's straight up. Apple doesn't feel dramatically different. Do you see it as
I
a
mean,
departure?
as from my end, and I'm not in the newsroom, sort of
No, but
looking at it from that end, but it doesn't feel dramatically different. I mean, you know, the idea of you know, several news sources on one platform, Blendle and in Europe, and Scroll, which is sort of the big player, the big emerging player, is, you know, is part of the model. But I think where we're going to see more of a shift to that, when publishers can see more ad revenue from those kinds of aggregation or that kind of delivery of, you know, one flat rate across the board, where, you know, they'll see more ad revenue than they will on somebody just clicking on a story, you know, with somewhere in between subscribing and actually just clicking on them, then I think we'll see more of a shift in that direction. But I don't know. I feel like there's a lot competing for, as a news consumer, there's a lot competing for my attention and my money, and it's sometimes easier not to choose.
Keith, you talked in the call about the resilience of video, which I think speaks to some of this, that good TV is good TV. It works whether it's on YouTube or on your TV channels, you flick through it, or your phone. If it's compelling to watch, you're going to watch it. Podcasts are really just good radio. I mean, it's a new style of radio, but it's functionally radio. The thing that changed is how we distribute it. Are we settling into a place where, with the resilience of video and stuff like that, that it becomes easier to figure out the monetization and the business model as there is some stability on the broader issues? I get Stephanie's point about it is a new platform every day, but the broader thing of just trying to get in front of somebody seems, or feels from my perspective at least, stabilizing.
Yeah, there does seem to be some stability around sort of quality video, and so like the CPM rates have been pretty, you know, not changing that much, because what we saw with display advertising was this sort of, you know, just so much ad spaces out there on the internet, and once you're into targeting audience rather than your specific properties, the rates just, you know, declined and kept going lower and lower. Video really has not experienced that, and so that bodes well for broadcast organizations. And as people may be cutting the cord, but there's people watching on Apple TV or this sort of thing, and a lot of opportunities to do ad support there. I think podcasting is a bit different. It's an amazing medium, and we're seeing really, you know, great growth on that. We've certainly seen it's original podcasting that's doing really well. You know, I think there was originally sort of a, let's just take our radio work and put it out there, and that only, with a few exceptions, gets you to a certain place. But as we've done more and more original work, the audience for it has been great. Interestingly, seeing a lot of uptake from Spotify on podcasting. You know, traditionally podcasting you think of as it's an Apple game primarily, which it still is, but Spotify's been big there. But there are still, I think, some challenges around how you serve ads into podcasting. It's harder to target audience. The analytics coming back as to who's seen what aren't as good. And then also, I think video still is a preferred medium in a way to audio. But I think the fact that there's such a great loyal audience there means that people are going to kind of figure out how to monetize podcasts.
One of my podcasts I listen to is Toronto Mike, what is that what his name is? I think it is. Anyways, media podcast, fascinating stuff. And he does a better job of building those customized ads where, he'll reach out to somebody who owns a shop or a thing, and they interact with him in the middle of the podcast, and then like the guest reacts to it. It's amazing to watch. And you've thought a lot about the customized nature of ads and how that's evolving. What did you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think just going to podcast for a second, it would seem that the most successful ad formats are actually humanly built, part of the show. And in fact, they'll even, there's one podcast that I listened to where the listeners asked for more advertising because he so nailed the audience.
Which one was that?
It's called Tech Meme Ride Home, and being in digital, it's all about technology. I'll give him a plug, 20 minutes, it's worth your time every night. And so he does a lot of advertising for developers and engineers, et cetera. So he's really nailed his audience. But the interesting part about that is how scalable is it, and how much money do you make off each one? When you work for a big enterprise, you have to think about those things. How do I operationalize that? Some of the technology hasn't caught up yet, so I think we'll see digital ad insertion, and already do, in radio and podcasting. But I think it needs to catch up a little bit to the consumer, as is often the case, before we see it become really super scalable.
And is it being done better at the smaller startup level, like the podcast I mentioned, or I don't know if yours is the one you mentioned is owned by somebody, but it feels like a lot of that innovation is happening outside of the CBC, the legacy guys.
Yeah, I think it's, you pointed to it, it is, this is how we started news on the internet too. We took what we did for television or the newspaper, and we still do in print for sure, and it works, but for television we just only slapped up what we did on television. We didn't create anything original. My own experience with podcasts and those sorts of things is the most successful are created by those, couple reporters, honestly, sometimes chatting and talking through the news in a way that nobody else really could. It is definitely that startup vibe.
Yeah.
If I could just 2 seconds return to Apple News for a sec,
Yeah,
because I do have a bit of a different perspective. I think the thing about players like Apple News, Apple also builds hardware. And I think the difference, at least from my perspective, is that they hand out phones. And on every phone is the Apple News icon. Now, of course, if you have an Android device, you can also get Google News, but they don't do as good a job of promoting it. And, whenever we've spoken to them, they've said, and they wouldn't lie about it, but they're the #1 news app now in the United States, and they only launched, when was it, 2015, 2014?
Yeah.
Didn't take them long. And that's because people have the device, and it's just super convenient. And I think the issue I have, and it's something, it's either, it is, are you worse for not being there or being there? You're establishing a habit with someone else. So the habit is to go somewhere else, not to you anymore. And we keep 100% of the revenue, and we've got to be there. But I think that's something we're going to have to get super strategic about as that relationship evolves.
Well, and it's interesting because part of that trend is that Apple is going from seeing all of its revenue coming from the hardware to a shift to it's increasingly a services company, right? And it's the growth in revenue on the services side, like Apple News and like Apple Music and Apple TV, all of that, they're shutting down iTunes altogether to make it one big, easier to access place, because it's driving a ton of money for that company. Asmaa, I wonder, in light of sort of all of this, how has the conversation at the student level changed?
I think when we're talking business models, I think a lot of students are just worried that they're not going to get a job.
Fair
And
enough.
I think that's important. I've got a few students here in the audience, all of them working and doing good things, but all still looking for that stable job. I think that we emphasize entrepreneurial skills, and we a lot of them. It's interesting. We did a project this semester, and so many of them were focused on projects dealing with solving the problem of freelancing, which is like a real career option at this point, and it's not a stable one. And it's one that that a lot of them don't hope to stay in for long. But I think it's important to be thinking about their careers entrepreneurially, and sort of that's kind of, they're their brand, and what they do, they can take that with them when they're looking for work. So for us, that's been a big emphasis for the students.
I wonder, just in the room, show of hands, how many people are like not on the business side, but are journalists, writing, reporting? Show, I am. And of you, keep your hands up, how many of you understand the fundamental business model behind wherever you work? Hayden's got his hand up. But I mean, is it something that we need to do a better job of talking about, let alone teaching and instructing at, like, once we get into the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I think the challenge is that the students are coming in from, like, they're in entry-level positions. They're not sort of able to, at bigger sort of legacy organizations, they're not able to make those changes, but they're at least able to bring a different perspective.
For sure.
But I think the real issue is, looking at, and I know this is not a surprise to anyone, but is really looking at how bigger organizations are making money and how they're thinking about their audiences. I mean, this idea of a mass audience is not something that's necessarily, it used to be a very, the concept used to be able to get your head around it, but now it doesn't, I don't even know what that looks like.
Right.
Yeah.
How many of them in school, and maybe they don't even talk to you about this, but how many of them want to be the next Lloyd Robertson or Adrian Arsenault? Like, I remember in J school thinking I wanted to be like Don Murray. I wanted that job. I wanted to write like him and talk like him.
It's really interesting, and I'll just talk about like first-year students coming in undergrad. How many of them want to work in television but don't watch television news, right? And so that's like a really interesting, question to ask, like a self-reflection, like, how do you get your news? Oh, but why? Okay, but do you don't watch? Why do you want to do it that way? Yeah, why do you want to do it that way? And a lot of it is to do with parents.
Right.
But it's it's interesting because we're very much focused on pretty large organizations with lots of journalists, and we're primarily ad supported. But there really is a lot going on and a lot of innovation in terms of smaller models. Things where maybe you can be profitable with just one person or 5 or that kind of thing. And so there's, I think, a whole different strategies around that. We were talking about The Athletic and how that works. We had someone from The Logic earlier today talking about what they're doing. So there are these sorts of, I think, cases for where people will pay for particular niche products.
Well, and we haven't talked about Pacific Rim, that I think did a really good job of breaking out and doing mostly branded content, but podcasts in a bunch of different ways that got bought up. Somebody got rich off that deal. Rogers got them, right? So, there's that model as well.
I mean, I think that's interesting. Sponsored content is something that I'd actually be curious to hear both of you talk about, because it's something that seems to have had, like, about 4 or 5 years ago, was a very sort of big kind of idea that people will pay for content that is paid for by companies that they don't know is paid for by companies, but will somehow be associated with the companies. But like that feels like that's not as prominent as it once used to be in a lot. Like the Globe, for example, has their Globe Edge studio where they're doing third-party content and that kind of thing. And I'd be curious to hear about what you guys think in terms of the role of sponsored content now.
Me too.
Okay,
Stephanie, you go first.
I'll go first. The most important thing to me about any kind of sponsored or branded content is that it's transparent, so that it isn't a question mark, first and foremost. The most effective executions are those that are created by a journalist, not necessarily a journalist who works for the news organization, but someone who is outside the organization. And it really is telling a story. It's not an advertisement, but super transparent about the financing and perspective of the story. I think that we need to figure out better ways to do it. I think the challenge is always, because it's those custom, amazing pieces that do so well. Again, how do you make it so that it's you can pump it out in a way that's cost effective? We have yet to crack that nut, truthfully. I think it's an area that we need to grow for sure. But it must
just
be
because it's money left on the table otherwise?
It is. I really think so, and I think we could be doing a better job of it for sure. I think we all do, but we do it here and there, but haven't really cracked the nut. Definitely.
I think it's a piece, and I think one of the things about digital that's sort of interesting is you kind of get there a little bit here, a little bit there. You have sort of your direct strategy, your programmatic. You've got sponsored content. You've got it's not as simple as the traditional broadcast model, which might have been you pick the right TV shows and
Right,
then
and away
sit
you
and wait
go.
for the phone to ring. We don't have that luxury, and so it's a piece. I think it had it sort of, I think it probably got kind of overhyped. Everyone saw what BuzzFeed was doing, and it seemed like, okay, maybe this is it. This is how we'll do it. And I think it didn't quite deliver on that, but it is certainly a tool, a part of your toolkit.
It's interesting that it seems to have been more successful in the print world than in the broadcast world. Is that a fair assessment? I mean, I think some of those podcasts have been branded, like, you go through the list and there's a bunch on there. But is it just inherently harder to make TV and be more transparent about the funding model behind it?
I don't know. I mean, I think we have some pretty great writers as well, and can hire some great writers. We could create a fulsome experience. In fact, I would argue that in some ways, also having a video business would give us an advantage,
Right.
Because it does do so well. So, I don't know. I think, again, it's something that we still have to sort through and figure out how to make it. If you, in a perfect world, you'd have various packages and you'd say, you can have A, B,
This is
C,
one of these. and
here's
this
the
is-
menu.
Right.
But often, and maybe this is why it really wasn't as successful or big as everybody thought it would be, is it's not like that. It really has to be on a case-by-case basis, truthfully, if it's going to work and if you're going to, again, maintain the integrity of your newsroom.
I think print's always had sort of advertorial, and so
Yeah.
it kind
So
of
there's a lot
translates into
it's easier to
that.
signal. at the
That's
very
true.
least.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges too is I think it's very difficult to do well, and I think
I
it works
agree.
when it's done well, like when
Right.
it's a great,
Yeah.
creative, useful thing.
But
It's
it
like,
often
okay, I'll
sucks.
read it, but really usually, it often stands out as not so.
Okay,
good.
we've got about 20 minutes, and I'd really like to involve as many of you as we can. I know we have a question here. Let's keep it simple. Just put your hands up, and I'll try to get you all.
Thank you. Hi,
Oh
my
my
name is
God, look at
Peter.
that
I'm from
crazy thing.
CMS for Mediacom. In Europe, we gathered together 400 publishers, local independent publishers from radio, television, in the digital world, and one of the most effective way gaining for them money is sponsor content, but for the digital, because we do it for PR and we do it for CEO. So they're like, last month we published about 1,000 paid articles in our network. So this is something I think you can also figure out if you're not doing it in Canada. If you are, I would like to learn about a little bit more about your experience. And the other source of the income for digital publishers are subscriptions. But there is still a rise of the question, what kind of the content people are willing to pay for the subscription. So maybe it's the question to you, Asmaa, if there's any research shows, especially for the local community media, what kind of content people are willing to pay for.
Yeah, I touched on that earlier, but the Reuters Institute study just came out, and they were looking at paywalls. I just had a number that I wrote down. They're finding the threshold for people to pay for content, for news content, was $15.79 a month, was how much they were willing to spend.
U.S. or Canadian?
U.S. And sort of they compared that to, I think it's $11.99 for Netflix now. And sort of this idea again that it's, it can be part of the subscription, but if it's bundled, you can't pay $15 for multiple publications. So I think that I think the challenge is, what is the collective value of that subscription? I just wanted to point out something that I was talking to somebody about this recently, but a real change in how publishers are referring to subscriptions. Now they're memberships, as sort of like we're members, so we're in it, the reader is in it with you, they're not subscribing to you. So it's an interesting semantic change and sort of what that connotes in terms of how perhaps publishers are seeing their audiences.
But it's come with a change in approach as well, right? Like the Globe does those cruises, and the Athletic does those like meetups. It's not just a semantic change. I think they've actually changed the way they think about it. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, please. So I'm a policy analyst with the federal government, so please take what I say with a grain of salt. But it seems to me news has certain economic characteristics that make it very vulnerable to market failure. Among other things, I think historically the model for news has been about less selling news than selling audiences to advertisers. And that model, of course, is now collapsing and is unlikely to recover. So what do we do about the fact that consumers have never really paid for news? News has always relied on other subsidies, whether it's advertising, philanthropy, private patronage, government support. The consumers have never paid the full freight for news. So what's the way forward given that reality?
I don't want to weigh in on that.
Oh, man. You know, there's no silver bullet, I think, is what we're finding. I think we have to experiment with a number of different models. I mean, in other parts of our business that I work on, we're doing direct-to-consumer stuff associated with video. So that's something that we always think about. You know, it's a great question. To me, it comes back to, because people haven't traditionally paid full freight for news coverage, what are they willing to pay for? And it would seem, based on my own anecdotal experience, it really is that original enterprise investigative journalism. And the thing about it is it has to happen over and over and over and over again. You can't just have one big story. You have to have them all the time. And certainly we invest in great journalism so that we can do that. But I haven't, to be honest with you, I don't think any of us have figured out all of the different ways that we'll recover. I think that as we see folks migrating to new platforms, my hope is that technology will bring forth new ways to distribute and sell news. It's interesting that as a new grad, you don't have to go to a broadcaster to distribute your content. You don't have to go to a publisher. You can actually do it yourself. And what we may see are the little sprouts of innovation that eventually we'll all adopt. I think it may end up happening over there. I don't think I really answered your question because it's an observation that we're all living with. I guess that's why we're all here. I mean, I think at the end of the day, here's the good news. People consume news, a lot of it. In fact, more than ever. That's the really good news. And the stuff we've always known, which is that good news and good journalism is still important and still meaningful, is still true. And people are consuming more of it than ever. What's changing is how we support that.
Did everybody hear what he said? He's asking if the business model isn't viable, what is the role for government?
So I'm gonna be a little snippy, but you guys need to get a grip on what's actually going on and hold others like Netflix and Google and Apple accountable, like the rest of us. Because Apple News doesn't have to support Canadian content, neither does Google. They don't have to do any of that. So a little frustrated, but honestly.
And if there's a policy response, I think that needs to be a part of it for sure.
Yeah, and we do, I mean, we're in this sort of very regulated space, but it feels very out of date with the reality of where things are. So absolutely, I do think the government and regulation and you know, those ought to be part of the conversation, you know, especially when you do, you know, think about everyone just has such a vested interest in, I mean, we've never been needed more, really, and at the local level, it's especially challenged, and it feels like there could be more of a conversation about that.
Yeah, Netflix getting $500 million or whatever it was did not really go over well for all of us Canadian content creators, so I'm just going to put that out there.
All right, let's move on. Question here?
This is for Asmaa. You mentioned 5 incubators. How did they do?
Oh, the 5 companies?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the mix of the companies is really interesting. So the one's founded by journalists. It's called The Sprawl. It's in Calgary. It specializes in what they call pop-up journalism, and the idea is that they focus on a particular topic, and every couple of months they've got an in-depth look into that. They've got a podcast. They've covered the election very deeply, the past election. They're really connected to the community. They've been doing really well. Now, they're a Patreon model. They are not for profit. They were actually, the principle for that one was that was kind of how they started, and that's how they wanted to stay. The other ones are doing well, but they're taking sort of different pieces of it. One, and this is something that we didn't touch on, but that perhaps is worth exploring, is it's a newsletter. And newsletters are becoming, are again, so to your question, part of like what can journalists do, I think the sense-making role is really important. There is a lot of information. Newsletters are a way, a personalized way for people to actually make sense of what's going on in the world. BuzzFeed does a good newsletter as well. But this newsletter is focused on women in sports, and it's about not just stories about women in sports, called The Gist, and they actually take stories about women in sports, but about sports in general, and the idea is that they refocus them for newer audiences who might not traditionally be interested in sports. It's a big generalization to say that women aren't, and I don't think that that's what they're saying, but they're trying to find a new audience for sports content in that sense. And they're doing quite well, actually. They've got some recent more investment. Another startup was looking at smart speakers and giving, and that's I think an area that we haven't really figured that out. The only thing we use our smart speaker for every day is to ask the weather, and my son asks questions about the Raptors, basically. It's a platform for people to publish their own shortcasts, but so their own short. For smaller news organizations is sort of what it's geared towards now, and podcasters, independent podcasters, and that's doing well actually also. I think that the interesting thing about the companies that were in the incubator was that they were about, they weren't necessarily creating the journalism, a few of them are, but they're also interested in how to get that journalism to audiences, and I think that's a piece we often, especially in journalism school, we don't think enough about the audience, and that's something that we're really trying to change. Yeah, I mean, working is, working. It's really, I mean, to Stephanie's point, and to what Keith's been saying as well, there is no silver bullet. There is no, there's no one answer. And I think there's a diversity of approaches. And I think that, I hope that continues, because really I feel like within that is actually the answer.
Yeah, I mean, the niche stuff, like I often refer back to The Economist has been a niche piece of journalism for 100 years, right? Like they figured that out really early and didn't bother with any of the big growing whatever else. And I think a lot of the smaller, newer niche operations are picking up on that model rather than reinventing it.
The key is, and this is where some of the business side comes in, and it's tricky, is to try to figure out the size of a market. If you have a great passion and want to turn that into something, I think it starts with, wow, how many people do I think would listen to this, and trying to figure that out. And then based on that, okay, how much would I need to make to sustain it as that one person, two people, and just start off that way. I mean, it's kind of at a certain point simple math, and I think, as Canadians, we're a smaller country. We can't scale the way that other markets can, so we have to be really smart about it and figure out, well, what's the market for me anyway?
Did you have a question down here in the front?
So I only pay for one paywall through one paywall for an alternative media source in the States.
Which
and
one?
Ooh, what is it?
The Young Turks.
Oh, yeah.
So I mainly did it because they have this cool podcast that has nothing to do actually with politics, that you have to pay to listen to the whole thing. But my view of it, and from my generation, is that to get people to pay, either the content has to be entertaining or educational / informative, or both. No one's going to pay to hear what Mayor Tory said at a news conference, So, and I think models like the Young Turks or other organizations, they've made, granted that's a little different because there's a political bias, but they have made their organization very personal with their audience. People, when they watch them, they feel like they know the hosts. The style that they bring on the news is not in the traditional way that an anchor would. And so I'm wondering whether there is room for mainstream media outlets to look at that and make their content not necessarily biased in any way, but more personal in a way that the audience feels like, oh, that's not just a CBC reporter, that is like my guy or whatever. Right. They feel they personally connected and personally invested, that the way that we see in the alternative media industry.
I mean, the legacy media struggles mightily with that. It's really hard. And it's like existentially hard, I think. But you guys are the experts.
Really. I mean, I think what we need to do, and Art
lost it.
Okay. I'm pretty loud anyway. We absolutely have to pay attention to what you guys are looking at and how you're looking at it, and think about what is it that appeals to you. Because I do believe that at a certain point, the model that's worked for many, many years and continues to work, frankly. I mean, we're talking about digital, but television still does incredibly well, and our national newscast still does incredibly well. But eventually, we absolutely have to think about how does the model need to change. I think we do try to experiment using digital, so our reporters will blog or create their own video pieces in a much more personal way than they can necessarily in a newscast, and that's often terrific. And I think we have to pay a lot of attention to what you're looking at, and then also measure it, measure the audience that's looking at it. I mean, again, it's just a lot of hard analytical work, paying attention to what you're doing and looking at. And it's always helpful. I mean, the other thing that we try to do is really talk to, we hire a ton of young people and ask them what they're doing. What are they looking at? Where do they go? I mean, that's really the best approach, I feel.
But can I turn it back on you? Why are you interested in doing that? Like, you three do a Young Turks. I was at an event with the women from the GIST last night. A bunch of pitches going on. There's VC money. It doesn't take a bunch of money to start up something like that. And do you think there's a market for people like you to watch something like that here?
Yeah.
And why do you need, the CTVs or the CBCs of the world to do it?
So I thought about that when we starting Ryerson in the fall, and at first I thought I wanted to go to a traditional news outlet. Maybe that's the case, but I've been thinking much more about, startups and how do you do something that's innovative and different, because that's what the future is.
Write a pitch. Ask somebody for money. I'm telling you.
Maybe, but I know, but you'd need a. But my concern, though, so as someone watches the Young Turks, it's very known there's a bias there. As much as I appreciate listening to that perspective, I do appreciate that you also do need somewhat of the traditional media outlets that give you more of an unbiased take on the news, and also have the resources to get to sources, to give you that quality reporting that oftentimes even the Young Turks can't do. So I think there's always a role for mainstream media, but I think there still needs to be innovation, of that we can't have the same kind of reporting we had in the 1980s and 90s, and thinking that people are huddled around TVs at 10 p.m. or 9 p.m. I don't even know what it is, the national, I even forgot. I used to listen to it as a kid. But so that's not sustainable, and so I think there is something to learn from those outlets, even if you don't become niche.
Dude, I want to see you do the show. Do it. I'd subscribe to your YouTube channel. Yeah.
20 years, 10 years, not 20. 10 years from now, you never know.
Year from now.
I remember
All right.
Sooner.
Who else has a question? Nobody? I mean, we're almost out of time, and maybe it is worth just doing a check-in. If you can leave them or us with an idea or a thought or a something about what can we all do. I really like the idea that we all need to understand our own revenue model better. What else can and should we be doing? Asmaa, you start.
I think the anecdote that I sort of raised about students not being as aware of their media consumption habits, I think as journalists we should be aware of our own media. I know we're abnormal, and I know that numbers about Twitter and that kind of thing were talked about this morning as echo chambers and that kind of thing. But I think if we can do a check on how we consume news, I think that we'll find answers, and not just us, but people in our circles. I think we'll find some answers about better ways to serve our viewers and readers.
Yeah, well, I guess you could turn off your ad blockers and subscribe to something. That would be very practical.
Not a chance.
I think, I sort of feel like within my organization, I can probably do more to be making people more aware of this,
Right.
So I think, and would also ask that the people within the organization be
More
receptive
proactive.
to that. And
Yeah.
I think that could make a big difference.
Last word to you.
Oh, man. I guess I would say if you don't understand and you're nervous to ask. Find a quiet moment to find somebody you think knows about the business and ask them about it. Figure out a way to convene a small group and do a bit of a digital boot camp where everybody feels comfortable and safe asking questions. And that includes executives. It's everybody who really needs to understand it. And also, if Frank, don't be afraid of the numbers. Tackle them just as you would any major story that you are investigating or trying to figure out. Go there, look at them, look for patterns, and take those away and figure out how to run a better business. You can do it just as well as anybody in the finance office, truthfully.
Yeah, I mean, think about how often you get chucked onto a plane in the middle of the night to fly to some terrible place in the middle of nowhere you've never even heard of before. And you can read up on the flight enough to land on the ground and sound like you know what you're talking about. We can probably do a little bit more. On the business side of it, I want to thank everybody for coming and for participating. I just want to reiterate Stephanie's point from earlier. We are making more and better news than ever, and I think that's really cool. And I think the fact that all you guys want to come and listen to us and get involved in this conversation about what the business model is gives me a lot of hope for what comes next. Especially from you young guys, and just thanks. I think it's a really crazy time, but it's actually a really exciting time in our business. So thanks, everybody.